Hello and welcome to our first Pomona Library Foundation book talk. Today I'll be talking with author Stephen Paul Leiva. His most recent book is called Journey to Where. From the About the Author page, it says Stephen Paul Leiva is a refugee from the silly fields of Hollywood, where he cavorted with such luminaries as Bugs Bunny and Betty Boop, although the latter was a brief affair. Stephen Paul Leiva has authored multiple novels. His work has been praised by literary great Ray Bradbury, Oscar-winning film producer Richard Zanuck, New York Times best-selling author Diane Ackerman, and Star Trek actor John Billingsley. Stephen has also received the Scribe Award from the International Association of Media Tie-in Writers. A traveler among several genres, his books include witty Hollywood thrillers, film novelizations, satire, sci-fi, and romantic fiction. You can find out more about Steve at his website. Hello, Steve. Glad to have you here with the Library Foundation. And just to get us familiar with your book, Journey to Where, I would like you to go ahead, if you could, and give us a little feel for the book. I understand you're interested in reading the prologue, which is very interesting.
Oh, thanks, John, and I'm happy to be here. Yeah, let's read the prologue. That's a good setup, I think, for this kind of book. So this is Journey to Where, a contemporary scientific romance, and this is the prologue that begins everything. In the first place, please bear in mind that I do not expect you to believe this story. That is how Edgar Rice Burroughs, that master of pulp fiction, the creator of Tarzan and John Carter of Mars, began his 1914 novel, At the Earth's Core. It was an account of an inadvertent trip to the true land down under, a land filled with dinosaurs, strange intelligent creatures, and the oppressed. I can think of no better way to start this account. But Burroughs' account was fiction in the guise of nonfiction, whereas this account is nonfiction in the guise of fiction. I had no other choice. True as this story may be, it is not my story. It is the story of my brother, Sam Reynolds. You may have heard of him. His fame in scientific circles leaked out into the general population early on. He was once dubbed the rock and roll physicist when he was very young, charismatic, and wild in his theories. You haven't heard of him lately for obvious reasons. But once upon, as they say. It is also the story of Sam's mentor at MIT, John Keegan, who was there and wasn't there, and the story of Laura Penrose, Sam's brightest grad student at Caltech, of Daniel Dorlac, a French nationalist, a physicist, and leading theorist in the existentialism of time, and of Bertram Brill, who also was mentored by John Keegan, and who also was there and not there, and may still be there. How do I know this story? How can I tell it in such detail? Sam came to me. He brought me John and Laura and Danielle with him. They told me their stories. They brought me a piece of physical evidence. Sam did not come to me because I am his brother. We actually don't like each other. Never have. Sam came to me because I am a social psychologist specializing in human deception. I study grand, eloquent liars and everyday tellers of white lies. I'm fascinated by self-aggrandizing liars. I've written a book. I've written the book on self-deception. I've appeared on television, local television, very local television, quite a number of times. I am an almost ubiquitous expert on the subject in this little pond I live in. And yet, my brother made sure I remained humble, telling me for years that psychology is not really a science, just a form of philosophy in a dress made of data. And yet, who did he come to tell his story to? A story that seemed so obviously on the surface a lie, an invention, a fiction. He came to me, a man who can tell a liar from a truth teller as easily as you can tell a cat from a dog. and I believed him. And there was the physical evidence he brought with him, which I have grown quite fond of, and which other scientists have assured me no longer exists in this world, or so they have assumed. That I have gathered all that I have learned, all the points of views of all of the participants I have immersed myself in, all of the facts and all of the emotions, so that I can now tell their story as omnisciently as possible. But as you will soon see for yourselves, I had no other choice. Richard Charles Reynolds, San Francisco.
Oh, so that sets up the basic story. It sounds as if at that point that it's going to be a time travel story with maybe some dinosaurs and some other things. You want to expand on where the story goes from there without too many spoilers? I'd hate to have readers know what's coming.
It would be so easily to put in the spoilers. Yes, you will, I think it's a time travel story as you begin, because the scientist, Sam Reynolds, is trying to find, his theory is that time is actually a physical entity. Of course, Einstein, space-time, we know all that. But he thinks there's an actual particle of time, which he called chrono, I believe. And he's traveled to a superconducting supercollider in the Arizona desert, I believe. This, by the way, starts off maybe 30, 40 years in our future. And somehow this superconducting collider has been built that's far larger than the one at CERN. So it really is looking into the mysteries of dark matter and dark energy and what have you. And he's lobbied for a long time to get the time to conduct a particular experiment to try to find this particle. But the head of the super collider, who was the man who found the funding for it, is an old colleague of his from MIT, and both Bertram Grill, who both were mentored by another scientist that is there, John Keegan, as the prologue points out. He doesn't like Sam, and he didn't want him to do this experiment, but he had to give in because of pressure, and he gives him only 12 hours overnight to do it without any of the normal staff being there. So that sets up sort of a conflict between those two characters. But let's just say the experiment is conducted and something goes awry. And they black out, the four scientists that are conducting it, and they wake up apparently 3 days later in the superconducting supercollider that has emergency lights on. Something has happened. What exactly is that? They don't really have any clue until they can get out of the collider and they look outside. Now, the collider, as you know, is a big circle, right? Huge circular thing. It has a hump that has all the cooling stuff for both the experiments and the labs in the middle of the desert. So they get up on top of this hump, which is how you escape from this in an emergency. They look into the middle. There's the Arizona desert. But when they look outside of it, suddenly they see a lush forest. There's not too many lush forests in Arizona. And then suddenly they see a herd of dinosaurs walk by. So now they are somewhat, I would say, not amused, not bemused. They're really confused. And we kind of go on from there.
Well, the idea of dinosaurs and that this is the past kind of works as the framework for the story, but it's really about many other themes. The society that they end up finding themselves in is extremely authoritarian, with slaves, with a very rigid hierarchy, and all the dictatorial things that you find in a very hierarchical society. This seems to be one of the themes. What are you trying to say with this in this world?
Well, you wind up in a world controlled by the Great Kwan. And their local language for the world is actually where the Great Kwan rules. So this is the journey to where. Obviously, they find out that they haven't time traveled because they suddenly are aware of intelligent bipedal creatures that obviously evolved from dinosaurs. And there's not just one species, there's two. One species that obviously evolved from more of the reptilian type dinosaurs, and one species that evolved from the bird-like dinosaurs. So they are the scales and the downies, or the downies. And what they find is what they have to think to themselves, wait a minute, if we didn't go back in time, then we altered time. And the asteroid never destroyed the dinosaurs 66 million years ago. So mammals never arose. So dinosaurs were allowed to evolve, and somehow two different species evolved. But it also means they've had 65 million years of evolution and hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of years of civilization that we humans have never had. So they find a society that's actually in a dark age, but it becomes obvious to them that there has been vast societies over millions of years that were far in advance of where we are now. But those have all fallen into ruin. They're now in a dark age society. It's ruled by the Great Kwan. They are discovered by these creatures and become, in a sense, the Great Kwan's pets because they're rather strange. They're bipedal. They turn out that they're intelligent, and the Great Kwan wants them studied for any benefit it might bring simply to him. And what they discover in this world is, yes, there are slaves, but the slaves are not based on species or color. It's just arbitrarily who the Great Kwan wants to be slaves. And he dresses them in a sack-like coverall that's yellow, so they're just simply known as yellow sacks. They could be either the scales or the downies. It doesn't matter. It's whatever he wants to be a slave.
Yeah, I noticed that. It was interesting that you decided not to have a racial element in there. And as a matter of fact, there doesn't seem to be any kind of racial thing going on at all. Is this because your future dinosaurs have evolved against racism, do you think? Or
I don't think it ever came up. Or it may have come up at some time, but at the moment, it's not there. And I wanted to take it away from that, to say that we designate who the other is, whether it be another race, the county next door, another tribe, because originally it started in Africa, and the other was always someone from another tribe. They weren't a different race. And here, because of the authoritarianism of the Great Kwan, it's, like I say, arbitrary. It's whoever he decides is going to be a slave. And what I've done here is, I call it contemporary scientific romance, which is the term that H.G. Wells used for the kind of fantastic fictions that he wrote. And it can be applied to Jules Verne. It can be applied in a way to Edgar Rice Burroughs, although he was more romance than scientific. And my great motto here is H.G. Wells. And Wells wrote a Time Machine, of course, and The Sleeper Awakes, and stories like that. But his overall theme was always the division of classes in English society, which is a theme of many books in English literature. But he was concerned about this division between the rich and the poor and how that becomes a class situation. In this story, the division isn't really between classes. It's not between races. It's not even between species. It's between the intelligent and the ignorant. And it's how an authoritarian leader and how authoritarianism uses ignorance to their advantage and will abuse intelligence to their advantage, trying to keep it or hoard it to themselves for their own power and not let it be of benefit necessarily to the rest of society. So that's where I make a division there. It really is talking about that division, which I think is very pertinent to the world we live in today, especially in this country.
Yeah, it was interesting. Also, the divisions within your human characters. You do have a character who embraces the authoritarian society, who thinks it's terrific, who feels that it's the way to survive within this alien society, while the majority of the characters are abhorred by the violence, the slavery, and the kinds of things that we as modern Americans would find abhorrent. Do you think that that's the way it might play out if something like this were to actually happen?
Well, there's certainly people that by nature um, are more comfortable with an authoritarian situation. I've always said that no one would mind living under a dictatorship as long as they agree with the dictator, you see. And in this story, Bertram Brill, who was the director and founder of the Super Collider and a intellectual rival for Sam Reynolds, and is not, quite frank, he's brilliant, but he's not as brilliant as Sam Reynolds. He's a natural bureaucrat. He's a natural player with power and player up to power to get what he wanted to. But as he said, he's the one that found the funding for the Super Collider that no one else in America could. Certainly Sam Reynolds couldn't, because he's a pure theorist. He lives in dreams of what may be. So there's different natures to everybody. Danielle Dorlac, who the French existentialist of time, she sort of is more pragmatic about everything and sees it and isn't that surprised. Young Laura is absolutely shocked by what's going on. And the older man, John, is a long life lover of humanity, and he really is upset over what happens here. So when actually they've are trained by, they meet what you might call a scale, by the way, is the overall term for both species, not scales, the saw for dinosaurs, the saws. They meet one that's sort of a scientist, and he's given them the task to take them in hand, teach them the Saur language and about Saur culture. And when they achieve that, they are gifted by the great Kwan with their own yellow sacks. They each get a slave. And at first, John and Laura especially are abhorred at this. We don't want slaves. Bertram says, don't mess with their culture. It's not our right to tell them they're wrong. Cooperate. And Sam finally says, look, let's do that, because if we don't take them on as our slaves, someone else will, and they'll be abused. And indeed, so they do take them on, but they treat them well. They feed them well, and they become family in a way, which the scales eventually notice, because they notice that their yellow sacks suddenly aren't as emaciated as most yellow sacks are. But, they let them have their way for a while.
It's interesting. It kind of harkens to the Star Trek Prime Directive idea that you don't mess with the society when you first encounter them, that you acknowledge that what they are, regardless of how abhorrent it is, and move on from there. I know that I called you in the about the author information a person who is across many genres. This one happens to be science fiction. Do you want to talk about why you choose a specific genre to get your ideas across?
Well, it's because I'm a eclectic reader of many genres, and like anybody, you're impressed and imprinted with what you read as a child or what you dealt with. So as a young child, of course, I loved science fiction, both in books, but especially in film and television. We are the first television TVs, aren't we, our age? And we were very impressed by that. And something like Star Trek, which you mentioned, came along. But there was also great movies. But there was also just the wonder of such stories as H.G. Wells' The Time Machine or Edgar Rice Burroughs, which were also done as movies, which could, gee whiz you and wow you and all that sort of stuff. But also I became, in high school, I got involved in drama department, and that opened up a whole world of literature, first dramatic literature and then other literature. So I'm a great reader of 19th century novels, and I love mainstream literature, and I love literary fiction. So it really has to do with the story you want to tell. In this case, it was the idea of doing a contemporary scientific romance that is, uh, romance meaning more the novel. That's what it means in this thing, or a teller of tales or a tale, than it means a boy-girl matchup, or boy-boy or girl-girl or whatever is in love. Um, I always loved him, so I always wanted to write one. So that's what I did. An earlier one that we might put in the science fiction category that I wrote, Traveling in Space, really, which is about, it's a first contact novel, which is a subgenre of the genre, which is always the story of the first contact between aliens and Earth people. And the thing is, most of those stories, the aliens are either there to conquer us and destroy us for some reason, or they want to mate with our women or steal our water, or they want to uplift us. They want to uplift us almost to the point of angels. They want to make us better. I thought it would be more interesting if an alien race came by and was totally surprised to find us. So my aliens in that are actually, they're basically scientists by nature. They're explorers, they're questers for knowledge, and they stumble upon Earth and are surprised to find the people there. And then they have to look at them. They have to study them. So it's sort of a space age Gulliver's Travels. It's satiric and comic, I hope. But then I have a book called By the Sea, because I always wanted to write a book that took place in a residential hotel, and you wrote about the people in that hotel and the surroundings as a little microcosm. So I did that, By the Sea. I created this residential hotel on a little scrubby beach called Leech Beach, somewhere in the United States. I don't actually pinpoint its geography. And talk about the people that work for the hotel and the community surrounding. And as it evolved, I realized I was writing about everybody's search for and need for happiness. So I took the title By the Sea, not only because it's by the sea, but the old song, by the sea, by the sea, by the beautiful sea, how happy we will be. So that's really an essay, if that's the term, on happiness and how all the different characters in the book find happiness. And it does end with a lot of happy endings. So that's a comic novel, and most of my novels have some humor involved.
I know that you also did a couple of books about that take place in Hollywood, and you have a background in Hollywood.
Yes.
Steve was the animation producer for Space Jam and was very involved in a bunch of animation things, including a stint as the president of Chuck Jones Productions and some other animation projects that didn't quite come to fruition, but went quite a way.
One would have been Betty Boop.
One would have been Betty Boop, and the other would have been The Spirit, which would have been an interesting project.
Well, The Spirit, which was a comic book written by Will Eisner, starting in the 40s. I always called it a superhero film noir. And I got involved in animation, and early on, this was the late 70s, was frustrated that animation was in the doldrums. Everybody thought Disney was on their last legs, and about the only other, say, animation were being made by people up in Canada doing the Care Bears, things for kiddie movies. In any case, I was looking for a project that would be more mature, more sophisticated, and more human-based, because talking animals are fine, but they wear thin sometimes. And I ran across, through a mutual friend, a test reel of animation by a young Cal Arts grad, had worked at Disney, was now somewhere else, named Brad Bird. Now, if you know that name, it's because you've seen The Incredibles and Ratatouille, and you know his work. Now, he's probably the best animation director in the world at the moment, if we cut out Miyazaki in Japan, possibly. Once I saw this test animation, which was like pencil tests, and it was framed like a trailer for the movie to be based on the spirit. I knew I wanted to get involved, and I did with him and one of his partners. And I got them to, well, I said, can I help you try to get this off the ground? And Brad, who has um, shall we say, he has his standards, told me, he said, I will only work with George Lucas or Steven Spielberg or Francis Coppola or Gary Kurtz. Now, Gary Kurtz had produced Star Wars for George Lucas. The other three, I'm sure you all know who they are. I happen to have been in contact with Gary Kurtz in his office just recently. So I said, I can get you to Gary Kurtz. I did. Gary Kurtz turned out to be a huge comic book fan, even had a huge vault of rare comic books in his office, and sold the project to him. And for 2 years, we tried to get it off the ground. I negotiated the deal with Will Eisner for the film rights. But unfortunately, this is 1980, between 1980 and 82, and Hollywood just couldn't see it. Brad Bird wrote the script with some help from his partner, Jerry Reese. And the studios liked it, but they kept saying, why don't we make it as a live action film? And of course, that wasn't the point of what we were trying to do. So unfortunately, it never got made. You can see the trailer on YouTube. Just look for Brad Bird, put in Brad Bird, the Spirit trailer, and you'll find it, and you can see what might have been. So that was sad. That never happened, but it was too early. Hollywood wasn't ready for it.
With your Hollywood background, one of the things that struck me about the book Journey to Where, let's get back to that, is that it struck me as a Twilight Zone episode. At your prologue, prior to your prologue, I can actually visualize Rod Serling stepping out and saying, consider for your consideration a group of scientists, something like that. It really has that feel. I know that you like Twilight Zone. Did it have an influence on this particular project, do you think?
I think it's had an influence on everything I wrote. Twilight Zone was huge, probably bigger than even Star Trek, because it was, and of course, Twilight Zone very much is close to some of the stories written by Ray Bradbury. And as you know, I've had an association with Ray Bradbury in the past. But it was the structure of those kind of stories, and always was sort of the ironic ending or a surprise ending. So that was very much impressed me. And when I first started to write out of high school, my first short stories were all Twilight Zone-like, always was sort of the ironic ending. So Journey to Where, I think, sort of has that feel, especially in an ending which we won't give away, obviously. But mixed with H.G. Wells, mixed with Jules Verne, mixed with those kind of high adventures. Never on Twilight Zone did you have a great, vast adventure like that, except maybe the one where the airplane suddenly is flying over prehistoric Earth, and they go to the past, and you don't know how. There's to that. But of course, those were influenced by Jules Verne and H.G. Wells. But I have what was originally a play and now a novella called Made on the Moon. And that very much has a sort of a Twilight Zone feeling end to it. So it's a, I honor it in stealing it. And why not?
Quite a fine job of it too, if I'm any judge of it, which I'm not, but what the heck. We're about to the end of our time, and before we leave, I'd like to ask what you've got coming up. I know you have you've been working on a couple of other projects. What can we look forward to?
Well, I have 2, maybe 3 more coming out. My current publisher, Third Street Press, I hope. The coronavirus has, put the wrench in a lot of different works. But hopefully this summer, another mainstream novel called Bully for Love, which I call a very odd love story, which is about a professor of history at Pasadena City College, close to where we grew up in San Gabriel Valley. And what happens to him in regards to love, and I can't really explain it because that would really give it away. But he's a professor at Pasadena City College, He also teaches for a friend, he decided to teach a adult extension or high school course, adult high school course at uh, um South Pasadena High School. And on the first night, in walks this absolutely stunning, unique, gorgeous, well-dressed, obviously richly attired woman to take his course in Western civilization. And it kind of goes from there. Where it leads to, I'm not going to say, but that is a pure comic mainstream novel. After that is a book called The Reluctant Heterosexual, and it is about sex in modern times. And those two books and By the Sea, I group in what I call my love, sex, and pursuit of happiness novels. That one has a slight science fiction element, but basically it is about human sexuality, which still thinks it's on savannas in Africa 200,000 years ago, and doesn't realize that it's in a modern world with the technology we have and our evolving interpersonal relationships with the opposite sex. There's a conflict between the two, which I think causes a lot of problems in our society. And so it very much deals with that. It's structured. I don't have chapters. I have what I call movements, because there are sections that have different tones and feels, just like a movement in a symphony. And then I have some interludes and a prelude and what have you for that story. And then hopefully they'll go with a little knockoff comedy I wrote called Creature Feature, which is a fun kind of spoof on old-fashioned monsters from the movies and what have you. And it takes place in the early 60s. And then now I am working on a book called The Definition of Luck, or The Postmodern Prometheus. And I'll just leave it at the title because I'm working on it. Never talk about what you're working on.
Sounds good. Well, it sounds like you've got a lot of stuff coming up, and we all look forward to it. I hope that one day when all of this craziness is over, that you'll be able to come and visit us at the Pomona Public Library and meet our public, our citizens of Pomona, and I hope they'll have much more interesting questions than what I've been able to come up with.
Well, I think you've done a fine job, John.
Well, thank you very much. With that, I will leave you, and I thank you very much again for the entire Pomona community. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Pomona.